had awoken, I could still hear the buzz of the helicopter blades. Adjusting myself to look at the window, I saw the endless South Pacific below. It seemed that we were still on our way to the island at the time. Honestly, the last couple of days have been nothing but travel. I had boarded a commercial airliner at JFK Airport, which took me across the country, landing at Los Angeles International. I thought that was where I'd probably end up having to take a flight to Japan, but instead, the moment I had gotten off the plane, I was met by a well-built gentleman in rather casual wear, and when he got my attention, I was told to follow him, where we'd get in a car and be escorted to Edwards Air Force Base. I guess I understand the nature of these assignments. Working with the military meant to be scooped up and taken to installations and ride around with the armed forces and all that. Song and dance I've done before, but still. Considering the base was not that close to Los Angeles International, it was well over 100 miles inland, we spent about an hour and some odd minutes in abject silence. And I'll be honest, it didn't really engender me to this assignment. When we finally made it to the base, though, I was directed to a hangar which housed a pretty impressive aircraft. It was a large turbo prop monster of a plane. Quad too, by the way. I think it's a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. I think that's what the officer had called it. Apparently, though, it wasn't going to be introduced fully for another year or two, making this an off-the-record test flight. Given that you have the clearance to listen to what I'm telling you, I assume you knew about this aircraft for years now. But when we took off from the base, I was given a dossier to read from now till we reached the base in Okinawa. It was a collection of papers involving the Lucky Dragon incident, and a little bit of the off-the-record and on-the-record information involving Castle Bravo. A map of Odo Island proper, which was much older than everything else, and it was slightly torn and made out of, I think it was old parchment or something else. More than likely it was actually from the island itself. How we'd actually managed to attain this is beyond me, frankly, but I didn't pry. Last of the things I got was actually a picture. It was of a younger Japanese man, David Sato. That was his name. Now, Sato was a corporal and had served in military intelligence as an interpreter. And to be honest, I was rather relieved at that, and was so thankful that someone was there to help me. As much as I had tried, Japanese was something I had not fully grasped. You'd think spending a lot of time in the Pacific had made me more accustomed to the damn language, which I had, but speaking it or full comprehension was still a shot in the dark. Interestingly enough, they said we were going directly to Okinawa, but we had a short refueling in Hawaii. In a way, the irony was not lost on me. I could see Pearl Harbor on our descent, and after a short top-off, we were back in the air. And then finally, we landed at Okinawa. Once landed, I was promptly directed to a helicopter, and which then I had spent like 3 different trips, 3 different aircrafts, going from New York to LA, and Okinawa, and now to Odo Island. Man, I'm so thankful I was never afraid of flying. I'd gotten used to it working out in the field, and although in those cases I was more afraid of getting shot out of the sky, here, it still took me, it really did just take the wind out of my sails. Waiting for me inside the helicopter was Mr. Sato. We introduced ourselves, and Sato was curious about learning more about me, and I returned pleasantries, but I mentioned I hadn't gotten much sleep beforehand and wanted to catch some before we landed. He obliged, stating he'd fill me more in about the island when we did land. Now finally, like I said earlier, getting some much-needed rest, I was more than happy to do so. I had been told, back in LA, that I couldn't sleep on any of the plane rides once we made it to Japan, just in case we had to divert our course or something were to happen. I didn't really pay too much attention, if I'm being honest. But I kind of wish I had slept on the plane ride from New York to LA. I assumed it'd be a quicker trip than what we were doing. Honestly, if I'm being honest, it kind of feels like we were being pushed around. We were taking longer routes, like we were running from something or looking for something. I don't know. But To be honest with you, though, a little sleep and a constant need to be alert at all times, in case obviously something went awry. And back in the war, it was things like ambushes, having to retreat or advance. There was a familiarity with the lack of sleep, and it almost made me think of home in a way. And as strange as that may sound, but when we finally landed, I grabbed my bags and took in my surroundings. But the copter had landed on a small hill near the shoreline, and as I looked out, I saw that the island had many of these rolling hills. The main village, it seemed, had been built on the side of a large one, in fact, with a series of houses and shacks cascading down towards the shore. As we moved away from the helicopter, it took off almost immediately, back in the direction of the base, I think. There was no indication as to whether or not they returned. Nothing. They just took off right away. It was like we'd been inserted behind enemy lines or something. And as it left, we saw a large group of villagers moving towards us. Some poured out of the village, while others from the shoreline came up to us, putting down their nets or leaving boats, while less interested folks stayed where they were. When they finally came up to us, we were surrounded by them. It was kind of disorienting, honestly. It was a cacophony of shouting and what I assumed were either questions or condemnations, as many of the faces did not seem all that happy to see me there. David had his hands up. I think he was trying to calm down the crowd or something. Obviously, I didn't speak Japanese, so I don't know exactly what he said. And I was turning from one villager to the next. I just wanted to see how many of them were around me, but in a split second, I saw a fist fly, and I got dropped to a knee. And I remember feeling David's hand on my shoulder. I was blinking through the pain. Now that bastard had a good right hook, I think. And I wasn't sure exactly who it was who hit me, but I could see someone getting pulled back into the crowd, and that seemed to have calmed them down, I guess. But once I looked at David, I realized why. He had a pistol in his hand, actually. I think, though. But no, I was definitely sure. It was a Colt M1911. It's a pretty nice pistol, standard, used by almost everyone during the war, and chambered in .45 ACP. Even with only 8 rounds, he would have dropped anyone who decided to take another swing at us. And even then, I still have the scar from where whoever it was hit me. The blood in my mouth was kind of raw, and once I rose to my feet, I could see that the majority of them were looking kind of concerned, probably that we were going to retaliate, or David was going to shoot one of them, honestly, but I put my hand on David's shoulder and whispered something into his ear, and essentially, I asked if anyone else wanted to take a swing, which I hope he did translate properly. Their faces turned from him and then back to me. Kind of a befuddled look, honestly, because they had no clue probably what I was saying, and then trying to understand what it was that David was translating for me. I explained that the United States government understood their anger, and that I had been sent, ostensibly, to uncover the problems that were plaguing the island. I understood that some of their number were unintentionally affected by the actions of my country, one way or another. And if the problems were here and are doing, then with the power invested with me and the U.S. government, I'd find some way to give them justice. Of course, I did not want to include anything specifically about radiation or the bombs. I didn't want to be implicated, honestly, in any way, but still, a little bit of cordiality and keeping the cards close to the chest. When I finished, there was a murmuring amongst the crowd, and they dispersed rather quickly, returning to their homes or back to work. One of the villagers, though, a rather older fellow, spat at the ground, which I guess rude, and I think he growled something under his breath before leaving. David turned to me, and essentially he said that they wouldn't bother us, really, but we were on our honor here, and I took that as fact and moved towards the village with him in, not really pursuit, we were next to each other, but he was essentially leading the way. I assumed more than anything, since he had been at the Okinawan Air Base, he'd been on the island before, so that was also reassuring. I asked, though, if that punch was their pound of flesh, which he shook his head at. In a way, from what he said, they understood that I was merely a messenger, and that violence wouldn't bring back the dead. I did, however, inquire about the old man, which David stiffened at. Japanese words, they're always so hard to pronounce, but Uragiri... how do you say it? Uragiri mono no inu. I think that's how it's pronounced. But David said it essentially meant traitor dog. But he crocked his neck, and I guess from what he explained, it was hard to be hated by people who looked like him and spent so much of his time working with people who didn't really trust him at the time. Of course, I'd heard about the things that had happened to Japanese Americans during the war, but I'd also heard about things like the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which had been made up of almost entirely Japanese Americans. Since, of course, I had been to the Pacific, I had never seen them myself, and as they had been deployed to Europe, I assume, or more accurately, I'm sure though, that this was to ensure that there was no hidden loyalties if forced to fight their ancestral homeland. Even if you weren't directly fighting, if you were Italian, German, or Japanese, the side eye from society did cast a long shadow on those people. It's unfortunate, to say the least, if I'm being honest. I made sure to put a hand on his shoulder for reassurance, and I told him essentially that hopefully our time here would give some closure to all of us, which he nodded, gave a small smile at, and I continued to follow him into a hut, where they were greeted by a rather portly gentleman, rather small and having a rather unruly beard. Sato greeted him, and they began to converse. He quickly turned to me, though, the old man motioning for me to put down my bags and to sit, which I obliged. I was so happy to finally be sitting down in something that wasn't a plane or a helicopter or anything. It looked like he actually had something on the stove, and he brought the kettle over and gave us some tea, which we drank, and Sato began to translate. Mr. Jiro thanked us for coming, and he says that we had hoped that our investigation would go well, and to help lift the curses off the island. Of course, I was intrigued at this, and I wanted to know more about what he meant by curses. And Mr. Jiro, through obviously Sato's translation, had stated that for the past couple of weeks the island had been host to many afflictions. There were fishermen coming home burned and scarred, some saying friends and family swallowed by the sea, and others would come home fine but then die in their sleep in the following days. There was also livestock missing or outright killed. Cows and pigs were found absolutely gone or torn apart. And from what he said, apparently there were demons in the cave, which many on the island attributed to the work of the gods. Or kami, I believe. That's what the Japanese believe in. But I asked more about the beliefs or what exactly these gods or demons were. Many beliefs, of course, are underpinned by actual phenomenon, and that likely helps a believer better understand and rationalize the world around them. And if I could understand whatever the superstition was, maybe I could uncover that phenomenon. But I guess whatever Sato said just didn't translate over well, because the old man he shook his head violently and was essentially holding himself as he repeated just a singular sentence. I dare not speak its name. We must never placate it with blood again. Of course, at the time, I didn't quite understand what it was he meant, but sooner or later, we all found out what happened. But as he just continued on for a while. It became a little unsettling. I wanted to shake him out of it. It was almost like he was in a trance of some kind, but we heard something else in the wind, and it was something I almost forgotten and wished I had forgotten about. It was the screams of people. They were exposed to horrors that they never should have been exposed to. David had tossed me another pistol that he had on him, another 1911, and we headed back towards the shoreline, and we could see that there was a big commotion going on, a lot of villagers around, and the group was just getting larger and larger, and whoever was crying obviously was in grave distress. We pushed through, and I made sure to kind of wave the pistol around to see if I could get me closer to whatever it was making the noise. And finally, once we pushed enough, the assembled masses parted and we could get a better look at what was going on. It was a woman. She was older, probably in her late 40s, but had She was holding the remains of a person. I remember David. He took in the scene for only a second before turning around, holding his mouth. I wanted to vomit too, and those are the tears, though. Just how they ran down her face, but she was cradling the corpse. Was mutilated. She was cupping the back of its head on her shoulder. Body was a mess. It was like it had been bisected. The arm was missing, like, right about the shoulder. Whatever had, like, bisected the body had done it at an angle, because the lower right side of the ribcage, that was completely gone, but the upper part, a lot of it was shattered, and there was so much open fractures on it. Bones were protruding so much out of that side of the body. It was like it had been pressed by a car or something. But the other side, that was mostly intact, but it wasn't that it was intact, but more or less it wasn't crushed, but it was burned, but it wasn't traditional burns, I know that. That skin, it's nasty. It was malformed, scabby. It was definitively keloid scarring, but I wasn't going to tell them that. Whatever the guy's insides, they were dangling out of it. They were dripping out. It was turning the tides that were at our feet. It was a muddy red. It was disgusting. I guess in so many ways I could be thankful for the war. I saw a lot of that, but it never got easier, unfortunately. But I didn't really need a translator to know that these people were related. A son, a mother, younger brother, older sister, aunts, nephew. Her agonized Willie made it all too clear. I remember kneeling down, and I could see the pain in her eyes mixed with anger when she met my eyes. I knew how much she probably hated me being there, and that whatever had happened to him was in some way the fault of my country, and I was the only American there, so I'm hated by proxy. But I kept eye contact and held my composure as much as I could, and her anger just gave way back to the deep moans again. But our investigation came first, though. I told David that I needed to take pictures, which David said to the assembled masses, and honestly, it kicked up another hornet's nest, and I thought I was about to get punched again. So I, of course, tried to ease tensions, but another voice came up over the rest. I looked up to see a guy who was about my age, a little younger, but older than Sato, wearing a large brimmed hat, plain clothes that essentially just looked like your average fisherman. Sato and him conversed, and their mutters went back and forth so fast that I had no clue what was being exchanged. But finally Sato turned to me, and he essentially let me know that the islanders wanted to give the boy's mother more time to grieve. Not to mention they wanted to give him his rights before I could examine him. I agreed to that, honestly. It wasn't going to interfere with my investigation, and if my investigation didn't have to interfere with their traditions, that was fine to me. And the two of them translated to the crowd, and everyone else subsequently shuffled the grieving mother off. It was a relief, though, thankfully, because I didn't get punched again, but I held up my hand for a shake, and I immediately took it back and bowed instead. I wasn't sure which one I should have done, the shake or the bow, and given what I had just seen, I should have the first thing that was proper. And even then, those bodies and just everything, it still haunts me. But it's moments like this, that the levity, I guess it brings me back to better times. But the man was a good sport about it. He gave a good chuckle, bowing back and grabbing my hand for a shake. I had the forward of him, and he said something quick to David before waving at us and following the procession. I was informed that his name was Tadashi. He's a fisherman, but he was also a mechanic. He was also the only person on the island who actually had a motorized boat for fishing. I assumed it was probably because he was rich, but David had corrected me and stated that he was actually someone who came to the island more recently. So, he was either the son of, or was a fisherman from the mainland and then moved to Odo Island. I'm not sure why, though. I guess maybe because he just liked living out on the sea, or like the island life. I don't know. Things are still bad in Japan, so maybe being away from everything gave him better opportunity. But at the time, I didn't know much. But the rest of the day, there wasn't too much to really report on, and nothing to really tell you. It was just waiting. They were setting up the ceremony and allowing the time for the families to console one another and for them to console the mother. And that took up most of the village's attention, so you essentially had two groups of people. Those who were staying to help with preparing and ceremonies and consoling and all that, and the others who were going out fishing. I was also informed by Mr. Jiro that their catches were very low this year, and because of that, that's why they were doing this shift system. There really wasn't much else for me to do. I took my bags. David handed me some of the equipment that the base had given us. Things like a Geiger counter, flashlights, things of that nature, weapons, ammo. We just had a radio, though. That was good. We made sure to set that up tonight, or that night, really, and in case something were to happen, something devastating, at least we'd have some way to call the base and get someone over here. But once night came, I decided that I wasn't going to be able to look at the body till tomorrow, so I went on a walk along the beach, and God, that was nice. The sound of the waves, the cool sea air on my skin, it calmed my nerves, and it was some of the most beautiful moments of my life. There's really something, though, even just seeing the sun set on the island and watching as the moon rose up beneath the waves. There was beauty in that, and I guess I've allowed this to be a little bit of a vacation in a way, but God knows what I was into. I know they're not healthy for you, of course, but I was in desperate need of a smoke, and I had not had one since New York, so I brought my foot on a small rock, and I leaned down to try to ignite the lighter. You know, there's always that issue where you're just trying to get that lighter in, and there's the wind blowing in from the ocean, so you're just like trying to get that lighter going, but finally it did, and as the flame flickered to life, I felt my leg wobble, which I was like, okay, maybe I was really getting shakes or something, good reason to quit, but God, no. I heard a loud chittering and lost my balance, and as I hit the ground, there was a searing pain that ripped up my leg. Fucking hurt like hell, I'll tell you that much, and I instantly kicked out at whatever it was that just did that, and as I crawled away, I could see that there was a black mass that was scuttling towards me. Even in the moonlight, it was shrouded in darkness, but soon, based on its size, I realized that it was the rock that I put my foot on, at least what I thought was the fucking rock. What I could now see were claws, these long things just tipped with dozens of little serrations that gleamed in the moonlight. I could obviously see my blood was on it now. I got on my feet and I was kind of limping back at like whatever the hell this thing was, but I could start to hear more chittering and there was movement all over me now, like all over the shadows. They were just everywhere. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt and I took the pistol out. Once I shined the light on them, I could see them, but I was still perplexed by what I saw. These things, they were deep green. There was no visible eyes or mouth on the top. The skin was very bumpy, also segmented too. It was a skin like, it was reptilian almost, but obviously these things were no damn lizards, but this front bulbous half is what gave way to the segmented back ends, but near towards the back, they were slender, pattering legs. They almost looked like that of a spider with how they tilted up and went down. And as these things just gained on me, they had this weird tittering noise in the sand, like a creepy ass, I'll tell you that much. It was like arachnid, horseshoe crab, scorpion. It was all melded into this abomination that God himself wouldn't dare to look at. I had my pistol drawn, and I fired at the closest one to me. I think it was the one that actually, whatever it was, Nick's claw bit me. And after the first shot, it made a loud squeal before writhing around the ground and then crawled up and apparently died, I guess. But another one came up fast on me, and the thing launched itself into the air. It launched itself. Like, I apparently have heard that some spiders could do that. Of course, this thing wasn't no damn spider. The thing was rather big. It's like a small, like, the size of like a small crocodile, essentially, but I only managed to dodge that one. More of them came. I could tell maybe about 8, 9, 10 of them maybe, but they were all converging on my position, so I fired even more shots. 3 shots as much as I could. I didn't want to waste too much of my ammo. I only had another magazine on me, but it seemed that every shot I took, at least it stopped them from pouncing, but I could see, however, though, thankfully, that there were lights in the huts closest to the ocean front that were getting turned on, so thank God those people could hear me, and gunshots never meant something good. And what it looked like, too, however, of course, if you have access to the samples, you may know this, or whoever has the samples may know this, but the front of their heads, they're not skulls, I've never been an expert with arthropods, but the front was so well armored that even when I took good aim, and I was not that far from these things, like maybe a couple feet at most, every shot it had this like weird tinging noise. It was like, I guess, for anyone who's ever shot on the range, you ever hit metal before, that ting noise that you hear, that's what it sounded like. A little bit more biological, if that makes sense. Full-on armor, able to stop 45 ACP. I wish we had some of those during the war, I'll tell you that much, but I just turned around and I hoofed it. I ran as fast as I could, but the cut of my leg was deep. Whatever these things had adaptation-wise, just claw at you. It's tough, it's sharp, and it really hurts. It hurt like a motherfucker. But as I was running, the ocean was now on my left, and I could see it was 2 more of them. It's made like either 10 or 12 now. But it looked like they were cupping the sand and dragging underneath their shells. I guess that was where the rest of the body was at the time, but I remembered, though, that was about where the boy's body had been laying. When the body had been taken away, there was still blood in the sand, and some of it was taken up by the waves and it washed back into the ocean, but they were after humans. That is a clear fact in hindsight, but they were sifting through the sand for the blood. It's amazing, though, that they were able to do that, or even had the instinct to do that. The amount of nutrients that you probably could have gotten from that blood was so minuscule, but the fact that they were doing it anyway, it speaks to a level of predation that we were not aware of at the time. But finally the cavalry came. It was several fishermen with spears and the like, and they charged these things, and instead of burying their weapons into them, their spears, holding them down with nets, taking wood. A few of them had guns and took a few shots, but in the dark, obviously, they weren't the best at it, and I made sure I had to move out of the way. I wasn't trying to get shot, or be the one getting shot on purpose, and get it covered up as an accident, but not everyone was lucky. A few of these creatures pounced on them, and their screams mixed in with the whines that these monsters were making. But I unloaded several more rounds, and I had to reload, and I saw the closest one lashed onto someone's face, and I shot that thing off that poor bastard. I hauled him up, dragged him back towards some of the other huts closest to the shore, and the remaining fishermen had similarly driven off the rest, but these things, if you saw them in person, they have no love for their fallen. That goes without saying. The ones that had been killed by us, they dragged them off back into the ocean, and it also looks like some of them were picking pieces out of them. So, cannibalism was definitely common in this species, and once they had carried off their kill into the Stygian depths, we all breathed a sigh of relief. Dave, of course, finally came down. He had his pistol drawn, but there wasn't really much else that he could do at this point. I, however, told him to tell whoever was in charge, because I had met who was in charge of this village to begin with when I got here, if we had a house that we could use to examine these things. And he obliged. He went off running, and I looked down at that cut on my leg, and jeez, that was awful. There's still a scar for it too. Like, it thankfully didn't hit my tendon or anything, but It really bit down towards the bone, and it took a bit of the muscle out as well. A little bit of a lump around there now. And at the time, I remember how much blood was seeping down into my shoe. It was even worse. It was like, God, it was like when you're going down to the beach with your kids and you feel your kid just get water all over your shoes, and you're like, God, Billy, don't do that. But yeah, it was awful. But I looked back over to the last one, the first one really that I shot. I was kind of confused because all the other ones had been picked off and they had dragged the remaining ones back to the ocean that had died. So my question was, why was it that this one had been carried off? I made sure to definitely kill the damn thing. So my pistol was reloaded and I just unloaded it. I like bang, bang, bang. One shot after the other. I made sure that thing was dead, and lo and behold, that thing screamed, it writhed around, and the thing was playing dead. I guess it's not that crazy, though. There's possums that play dead, snakes play dead, but they play dead to avoid predators. Something playing dead to then attack us. It was something else, and not to mention the fact that these are giant insects, like water bugs or whatever they were at the time. I wasn't sure. So once the thing was dead, I grabbed it by the back of its tail and was hauling it through the village. I was more pissed than anything because I didn't have my smoke, but yeah. I was soon to learn what horrors really did plague this island, and these things were just the tip of the iceberg. End log.